Good morning, everybody. We're online, I guess, huh? Good morning. My name is Petra Stienen. I'm the Vice Chair of the Equality and Non-Discrimination Committee at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. I'm in The Hague. It's a great pleasure to see you all. I think we will have an amazing discussion. It's such a timely day. Okay, I got a remark that we're on Facebook, which is great. Well, we have this amazing webinar, which with the title "Taking a Stand Against Racism, Discrimination and Institutional Racism in Europe: The Parliamentary Response." Today is a very special day in the Netherlands. It's called Kitty Kotti, which means the chain is broken. We are commemorating the Emancipation Day in Suriname, the emancipation of people who were enslaved. The slavery was abolished. Actually, in 1873, people were really free. And this afternoon, there will be a debate on institutional racism in the Dutch Parliament. And of course, we have seen the demonstrations throughout Europe in solidarity with what was happening to people of color in the United States of America, but I think also revealing many of the inequalities in our own countries. So without much further ado, I am so pleased to have four very, very distinguished panelists. And we also have our great president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe with us, Daems. But before I start, I would like to ask everybody who's on the call to switch off, to mute their microphones, and to only open it when you're speaking. Rick, could I give you the floor?
Thank you, Petra. I hope everyone is hearing me well. A very good day from Strasbourg. I don't know where you're all at, but it's a very international way of working. As I told before, I love these webinars and video meetings. Obviously, it's so much nicer to be together, even close together and have a chat and all that. It's a bit different. But then again, on webinars, I think it's a very good technique. So Petra, thank you for having me and all of you. A very good day from the sunny Strasbourg. I hope it's sunny at your side too. It's a very important webinar. Let me start out with a very simple remark. Petra knows this as a member of our Parliamentary Assembly and as a rapporteur of one of our COVID reports. The Parliamentary Assembly is very much result-driven. So let me ask from the start whether it would be possible, given the fact I will not be able to be with you the whole webinar, if we can have some kind of an abstract. Liri is in the meeting. Just for your information, Liri will take over as my Chief of Staff of my private office next week. This is a good test for Liri to have an abstract and that we can see what in practical terms we can do with the exchange of views in order to take action in the Parliamentary Assembly. Now, a few remarks. One, it is always unfortunate that it always takes some tragic event, in this case the death of George Floyd, to have this wall of silence and complicity to fall down. I mean, it is unfortunate. On the other hand, it puts us once again, and many more than us, because this is something that we do on a daily basis, the fight against racism, intolerance and inequalities. But it is something that at least hands over a way of, again, igniting this fight more than yesterday. Now, racism, and you all know that this is very deeply ingrained in our societies, be it in our labor market. This is going to be even worse given the COVID crisis. In the media, it exists. In education, it exists. Just think about education going over into a video mode, where, like, for example, on language basis, not everyone is getting equal chances. But also in popular culture, are changing these mindsets and really eradicating racism to the roots. It is not only our duty. In my case, I think of it as being a moral duty. It's much more than a job. It is really a moral duty because, I mean, societies, healthy societies, they thrive on diversity and they treat their citizens as equals. So this is the basis of the work we do, and this is also the basis of the moral duty that we have to fill in. It is important, this kind of a webinar, for us to listen in as a Parliamentary Assembly, listen to what you have to bring us as information, and take action. And this is for me not like a free ride. This is really something, not only this webinar, but all the other ones, try to distill elements that we then can use and move on with it in our national parliaments. The unfortunate death of Mr. George Floyd also made that now suddenly in Europe, we started to questioning ourselves and also our history. This is important. Of course, I've got a very practical case in Belgium, because if this wouldn't have happened, I don't think that our king would have felt the need to express his sincere regrets concerning the colonial past of our country, and at the same time renew his commitment to combat all forms of racism, which is something that he is really very adhered to. But again, it is important to look into the history, learn lessons, and also take action. And he has done it in his way by expressing sincere regrets. I applaud the fact that he has done that. He has done it, Petra, by the way, without consent or even informing the government, which is very rare because, you know, normally a royal head can only say something if it is agreed upon by the government. And maybe, I mean, all of my advisors told me not to say this. Anyway, you know me, Petra. So I'm a little bit looking forward to see if King Philip's royal and other peers, what they will do in the coming days, weeks, and months. I'm not saying this is an example, but I am saying that if it touches the heart, the mind of these kind of people, it is important for them to have that message out, because it fortifies us. It makes us stronger in order to combat racism, intolerance, and inequalities. Now, I understand also that the COVID crisis is part of the scope of what you're doing. Well, you're very lucky, all of you, because Petra is here. She is the rapporteur on one of the 5 reports that we're going to be debating on, and which will be one of the bases of what we call, or what is called in the Council of Europe, like a ministerial conference. There's one in November under the Greek presidency. And it is very interesting for you to know that in this Athens Declaration, because that is what they're aiming at, they want to have some standard setting concerning how to go about with the COVID crisis and racism, intolerance, inequality, which is unfortunately rising because of that crisis. So there will be an element in that Athens Declaration concerning how do we cope with it. The Athens Declaration is not a free ride again, but it can go from a simple declaration up to guidelines, up to even recommendations, which is a very formal thing, of the Council of Europe, addressing the 47 member countries, saying, listen, this is what we recommend you to do. If you look at, for example, the handbook we've got on the Istanbul Convention, I mean, combating violence against women, I mean, this is something that is very concrete. It's got a checklist. I mean, I hope that this recommendation, I hope it will become a recommendation, the Athens Declaration, because then it's some kind of binding to the 47 countries, and these kind of webinars, as far as I'm concerned, are very, very important to not only within the context of COVID, but also out of it, to start really hitting on this kind of a neo-racism, because we're seeing some kind of a neo-racism coming up, and we really need to go against that with all the forces that we have. Now, I'm also very happy to have Mr. Momodou. Well, Mr. Jallow, I should say, but Momodou, I heard Petra say hi, Momodou, so I'll do the same. I'm very happy to have you here, because obviously, I mean, your mandate on combating racism and intolerance, I mean, it demonstrates a political commitment to keep the issue not only high on the agenda, but to do something about it. And that's why I would like to thank you for your tireless work to raise awareness about issues related to racism. I would say, go on, do it even more than today. I mean, I told my peers I would be a full-time president. That's like they say 24/7. Well, no, it's like 24/8 or 28/10. Do the same, Momodou, because it is really important to have you on board, and obviously all you other people to help us in combating and having this fight on. Now, maybe one last remark I would like to make is because I came up in an interview I gave for France 24 a few days ago. It came into my mind saying, if you are against something, it's important because you take a position. But when you're in favor of something, maybe it allows you to have more people on board. And this is why, as a conclusion of my initial of just this introductory words, I would like to say the following. What would happen? Why not try to have a movement against racism, which is very important, which we support fully. Once we can really get on board, why don't we try to have this movement against racism convert into a movement in favor of equality of all men and women? That seems to be something that would be a step to get a lot more people on board in order to, at the same time, combat racism, inequalities, intolerance, and what have you. You would have a movement in favor of equality, because that's what all about. As I said in the beginning, a healthy society can only thrive on diversity and on equality. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, Petra, and all of you for these introductory words. Again, I hope that I know that Liri will get me an abstract, and I know that Petra, once that abstract is made, she will head out to me and say, listen, Rick, you promised to do something. And you know, when Petra wants something, I cannot refuse. Have a good day.
Okay, Rick. Thank you very much. If I may summarize 3 key thoughts in your introduction, we have a moral obligation to stand up against racism, but we should take action for a society where we are working towards equality. And if I may also quote the World Health Organization Director General, Mr. Tedros, who said last week in a seminar, every voice matters. I think it's very important that every voice is being represented at the tables of decision and in our parliaments. And if I may move to the next speaker, and please, I hear that somebody doesn't have their microphone muted. Please, could everybody in this call mute their microphone? If I may go to the next speaker, Mr. Jallow, you have become a household name in my household. When my daughter saw you speak, a 22-year-old white girl she was born in Egypt, she was demonstrating for Black Lives Matter in her university. As I said, you've become a household name, like a moral compass in my household when it comes to standing up, being an ally, and you're such a source of inspiration. So I am so proud to introduce you. You are a member of the Swedish Parliament. You are extremely active in working on combating racism and intolerance in Europe, but I also know that in your upcoming report, Combating Afrophobia in Europe, you will have recommendations that are forward-looking and will inspire not only the young generation, but also many, many members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Petra, for those very kind words. Please allow me to thank also the President of the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe for for your well-chosen words and very important stance that you take against racism. And I personally want to show you that I really want to express my appreciation, because we need to speak about it. And I know it is sometimes uncomfortable, but when it is uncomfortable speaking about racism, it is even more uncomfortable acting against racism. So we need to get out of our comfort zones and really act against racism. And I really appreciate you being part of this conversation and taking a stand against racism. I woke up this morning and on my social media, I saw an article from New York Times with the title, "A Young Black Man," and his name is Philip Mbuja Johansson, 28 years old, was tortured and killed on a remote island in Denmark by 2 white men with known far-right affiliations. One of them had a swastika tattoo on his leg, but the authorities are refusing to call it a hate crime. This young man, Mr. Johansson, mutilated body was found at a campsite According to the preliminary indictment, his skull was broken after he was beaten several times with a wooden beam. He was stabbed multiple times. A knife was driven through his throat, and a knee had been placed on his neck. He died sometime early Tuesday, according to the forensic report. And the prosecutor of this case told the local newspaper that the killing had nothing to do with his skin color, but it has everything to do with a personal relationship that has gone bad, that has gone wrong. Now, I can name several other people. Wuri Jallow in Germany, who was burnt alive. I can name Adama Traore in France, and I can go on and on, but we don't have time. This is a reality that people of African descent face, which is absolutely brutal. So that is why what happened in the United States is important to us. When we saw that video of George Floyd dying, really struggling to breathe, that is something that triggered some sentiment that we've had for a long time, Black people. And when European leaders continued to say, in my own country, in Sweden, continued to say, this is not a problem in Europe. This is a problem of the United States, so don't import it to Europe because it doesn't exist here. For me, it reflects a denial that we have seen for so many years. It reflects minimizing our pain and minimizing the historical suffering that people of African descent have endured from over 400 years. And it's important. That is, for me, is the fundamental issue, the denial of the realities of people facing structural and institutional racism in Europe. We need to start talking about it. And that's why this seminar is important to me. So let me just say, Europe is ethnically diverse. It has always been and always will be. This in itself, this is not a problem. The problem is the experiences of the people of color that live in Europe, particularly those of African descent. We have neighbors and compatriots that have ancestry drawn from over all of the world. In Malmo, where I live, we have people coming from all around the world living here, speaking over 100 different languages. But the image of the brutal, tragic death of George Floyd triggered a protest movement not only in the US, but around the world. The scale and intensity of the protest illustrates a deep sense of frustration and pain, not only in the US, but also in Europe. For the longest time, this pain has for the longest time been neglected, and there has been no regard for this pain. And the usual silence and exceptional entitlements from European leaders are no more working as this. This is not a moment, it's a movement. Before we would say, this is not for us. This is not something, we are not like the UK. Sweden normally say, we are not like the UK. We are not like America. Europeans would say, we are not like America. But that entitlement does not work anymore because this is not something, the movement we're seeing is going to last a longer period of time, and there needs to be dramatic change for this movement to be able to be satisfied and to be quiet down, and which I don't think is going to happen anytime now. Although we have a series of evidence of structural and institutional racism and racist policing fueled by historical abuses and negative stereotyping leading to exclusion and dehumanization of Black people in Europe, the problem has always been the recognition of this reality. And we need to go from the denial to recognition. And too often, we also know, that one's ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation is a marker of exclusion and disenfranchisement in Europe. This remains too often true of the estimated over 15 million people of African descent or Black people. This is why we must face this challenge also, not only looking about it from one perspective, but we also have to look at this challenge from an intersectional perspective. Why we know, if you're Black and if you're a woman and if you're a Muslim, or if you're an LGBT person, your reality is even a lot more difficult and harsher. And that's why we need to look at it from that perspective. And we've seen over the last decade an increase in both in gravity and number in the manifestations of both structural and institutional racism in all its forms. We've seen it, as it mentioned by the president, from the labor market. We've seen it in the health outcomes. We've seen it discrimination in the immigration and criminal justice system. We've seen racist violence. We've seen police brutality. We've seen ethnic profiling, poor educational outcomes, weak political representations. You can name it. Black people are always at the lowest on this ladder, on this hierarchy. And knowing this, and we have data that shows this, even the latest data by the EU, by fundamental rights agencies being black in Europe, illustrates the situation for people of African descent in Europe. But the question is, what do we do about it? Do we ignore it as if, it never takes place? Do we continue to do that? Or do we take our moral responsibility and say, we have to do something about this? Not only talk about it, but actually act and make sure we have legislation that is required and follow up those legislations, make sure that they are implemented in our member states. And that is something that we need to really take into consideration. Let me just, before I conclude, let me just quote what George Floyd's brother said. He said, I want people across the world and the leaders in the United Nations to see the video of my brother, George Floyd, to listen to his cry for help, and I want them to answer to his cry. I appeal to the United Nations to help him, help me, help us, help black men and women in America. But I would also like to add that there is a George Floyd in every part of Europe. And just like George Floyd, many of the people of African descent can't breathe. And it is time for the European leaders to stop the constant denial of our collective and historical experiences as black people, recognize their blind spots, listen to the demands for justice, equality, and human rights. Because it is within my mandate as a General Rapporteur on combating racism and intolerance to highlight the persistent experience of racism, discrimination, and exclusion that many people of African descent and also other racial minorities face. And for us as the Council of Europe, as guardians of democracy, rule of law, and human rights, we are obliged to ensure that member states recognize the existence of institutional and structural racism and act politically to address the consequences of this scourge affecting millions of European citizens and residents of color. When we choose to deny or be silent in the face of bigotry, hatred, and racism, then we are doing nothing but being complicit. And our complicity, it stokes the flames, perpetuates and legitimizes intolerance and bigotry. We create division rather than unite the people. And we most importantly undermine the fundamental values of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So this is a challenge not only confined to the boundaries of the US, but rather very much present in Europe. And when we fight structural and institutional racism, we must look at the deeper causes in order to fully address it. And I hope we'll be able to do that with my report and some of the recommendations that I'll be presenting on this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Momodou. When I listen to you, I think we can only breathe. I can only breathe if you can breathe the oxygen that is there for all of us. So we're sharing the same oxygen. When you breathe, I breathe. And I also feel that mentioning the pain, pointing out the pain, is sometimes very painful because people immediately think, am I guilty of your pain? And yes, sometimes we are. And sometimes we have to say, I am sorry for your pain and for my role in your pain. How can we move on together from this? And I think your report will also inspire parliamentarians to do their work in translating this transition from denial to acknowledgement to respect of rights. So I hope that this webinar will help you to also be inspired by the conversation we are having at this moment. Unfortunately, I have a bit of sad news because our next speaker, Mrs. Pierrette Hertzberger-Fofana, who is a member of the European Parliament, and he's also the co-president of the Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup of the European Parliament, doesn't feel she's capable of participating in this webinar at the moment because of the hardship she's going through at this moment in Belgium due to the horrible incident she experienced on the 17th of June when she was attacked. She says she was attacked by the police, and now the police is saying that this is actually not true. I am so sorry that she doesn't feel well enough to be in this call, and we can only wish her, and we will make sure that our team will transfer our best wishes for her in dealing with this ordeal after she spoke up and spoke out. As we're talking about sharing pain, we are with her in solidarity. So I would like to move to our next speakers. I am very pleased to introduce Domenica Ghidei Biidu, who is the Vice Chair of the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. And I received your CV, Domenica, and if I were to read everything that's on that CV, it would be 3 o'clock in this afternoon, so I won't do this. But I read a recent interview with you in a Dutch newspaper, and you said, now racism is a hype, but we have to look for structural change. And I'm very curious to know, what do you mean with this, and how can parliamentarians in Europe play a role in this structural change? And of course, I would like you to talk about your organization as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. And thank you also very much, Rick, for the points you brought forward. And if as chair of the Parliamentary Assembly is saying such important words, it gives it's a message of hope, and also of how the Parliamentary Assembly is a place where it is standing for all Europeans. And as Momodou has said, I cannot summarize what you said, Momodou, because it's really heart-touching, and what you said I completely support, because that's the voice we need, and many people like you who are doing this and repeating this. And one thing I would like to put forward first, it is as if we are waking up now on the struggle which has been going on for many people to work against racism in Europe. We have been doing this for a very long time. People of African descent, Black people, and others. So there is this kind of amnesia, which is, and we forget. And I'm happy that the new generation is coming, is standing up and fighting. At the same time, we need an intergenerational dialogue on this issue so that you build on what was there already. And that's something we need to do as well, so that you don't feel alone. You know that someone else has been doing some work, not every time visible, but there have been a lot happening in the past. So that would be a very important thing. Another thing I would like to say is something about ECRI, because I'm here in my capacity of the Vice Chair of ECRI. ECRI, in the 25 years we have been working as the monitoring body of the Council of Europe. That is our main issues. How can we, in our advisory character for member states, the advices we can give on the legislation, on all the activity the government can do to combat racism. So that has been our work for 25 years. And since we are here part of what the Parliamentary Assembly is doing, I would also like to remind you on the charter from 1998, on which was initiated by the predecessor of the FRA and endorsed by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe and the European Parliament and ECRI. It is the Charter of Political Parties. And it's a very important document in which, in your capacity as political parties, as parliamentarians, what can you do with the Charter of Parties for Non-Racist and Society? What can we do on it? Of course, it's a little bit outdated, so that was the reason that ECRI, during the anniversary meeting, our then chair, Mr. Lerner, discussed the revision, and with the former PACE Pacha president. And so the plan was that in April there would be hearings on what can be done. Unfortunately, because of COVID-19, that couldn't take place. So we are really hoping that the hearing is going to take place as soon as possible. So that would be one of the points. Another thing I would like to raise is, as Momodou was saying, in order to have a strong party who is going to monitor in many countries, you need a good representation in parliament and in places of power. Because otherwise, what you see is in the past, especially, for example, if I say situation in the Netherlands, the institutions which were built to have a dialogue has been dismantled because of austerity measures and other things. So what you see is that the situation of racism, it's institutional. It's not only on individual level, because if you split it down in individual, then what remains is diluted. But when you look at it as a collective and institutional issue, then it shows that there is a trend, that it's structural. So that's very important to address issues. And then it's not what happened to you, Momodou, and then forget all the others, like the example you mentioned on Denmark. So if you don't take the context into consideration, so that's why the reason of underreporting, which the FRA has been addressing many times, and we as ECRI also find it very important. So you must have confidence and trust building measures that people understand that if they complain, if they make things visible, there is going to be a follow-up and understood what it really means. Unfortunately, when we talk on legal cases, the context is not many times taken in consideration. Every now and then it is, but most of the time the question is what happened to you individually and what has happened. But as we all know, racism is not only on individual level. If you don't take the context in consideration, it's very difficult to prove. So that is very important, to look at the legal part and also at the sociological and anthropological part of things when discussing racism. Another point I would like to make is, in the past, we used to talk about integration in many parts. So, but if, as Momodou was saying, at least 4 centuries of painful and also joyful interrelation we have had, people of African descent and others. So it's not a question of integration, it's about the recognition of the history, as you said, and also the recognition of the impact of history in everyday life. And now there are many articles coming in which you see the statues which are now being demonstrating and tear down and also things. Of course, by tearing down the statue, you don't tear down. It's a symbolic gesture. We need more than that. We need more statues of heroes, of people who have been fighting for their independence. And which is part of the European history, because the struggle of independence from the European colonial past is also part of history of Europe. It's not a part of history only on the former colonized countries. So, and also the liberation struggle, and also when we think about the commemoration of the freedom of different countries, be it France, be it Second World War, we have had many stories of how people from the former colonies, people of different countries, have participated in the in the liberation of France, the liberation of the Netherlands, or in Britain. We have had many soldiers, of course, so we need also to honor that people have paid their price. It's not only the American Party of Vietnam, it's also all the European powers. Of course, it's a very problematic history in which why do you collaborate with the colonizer and oppressor sometimes to oppress others? So it has a very uncomfortable part, but people have offered their lives. So that is on yes. Important is that we look at institutional racism, that each organization in each country, that the laws are in place, that the institutions are in place, and that they look at what they can do to dismantle racism. It's not something you can do overnight, but it's how do you do it step by step. You have to have plans. And by doing this, you need to collaborate with the broad spectrum of people of African descent and all the other minoritized groups in order to have nothing about us without us to be a living value. I'll stop here for the moment.
Thank you very much, Domenica. And talking about the intergenerational aspect, I wish that people would translate the Volkskrant article of parents and children who have been fighting. The parents have been working against racism for quite a long time, and you were portrayed with your daughter, and I thought it was an amazing article, so maybe we should translate it into English. And talking about representation, we're politicians here, so I'm very proud that my party, D66, is actually the party that has sent a representative to the European Parliament, who, unfortunately, I have to say, is the first woman of African Caribbean descent, Samira Rafaela. And I remember vividly when she came to the scene a couple of years ago, people were like, well, who is this girl? And there was sexism and racism in that comment. Because I said, this young woman has been working as an advisor to the mayor of Amsterdam for a couple of years, and she was the advisor to the head of the Dutch police on diversity and inclusion. So this woman will represent other voices that have not been represented yet. You said many other things I would like to comment on, but this is not about my webinar, it's your webinar. So we will go further to our next speaker, Ojeaku Nwabuzo. You're from the European Network Against Racism. Actually, Momodou has been working with this network as well. So I would be very interested in your work, and I learned that you have recently published a roadmap for European institutions. Well, they can use this roadmap how to address institutional forms of racism. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yes, my name is Ojeaku Nwabuzo. I'm a Senior Research Officer at ENAR, which is a European network of anti-racist organizations. We've been working for over 20 years now. With my colleagues here, Jallow and Domenica, we've been working with you as well. The problem with coming last on the list of panelists is that you might repeat some of the things that have already been said, but actually it gives me kind of some confidence in what I'm saying because it's already been reiterated or said in some way by the previous panelists. But I would really like to thank everyone for this opportunity to discuss and present how we can tackle systemic and institutional racism. I've been working on race equality, I like to call it race equality, for over 10 years now and based in Brussels for 6 years. And some of the work that I've been doing with Jallow was around a report looking at Afrophobia, which was published by ENAR in 2016. And it was one of the first pan-European reports looking specifically at the situation of Black Europeans, Black people in Europe. And we were talking about discrimination and racism in health and education and all of these major indicators. And since then, you know, I'm really pleased to say that the Fundamental Rights Agency, as Jallow mentioned, have also published a report on Black people in Europe. There is also a resolution in the Parliament on people of African descent. Most recently, we've had a commitment from the European Commission to develop an action plan to tackle racism and discrimination. All of these things are really promising developments and really encouraging developments that we support as a civil society organisation. One thing that these reports and documents and resolutions all have in common when we're talking about people of African descent is the continued problem with policing. And given the context of this discussion, I would like to focus on this in particular, because there is so much we could talk about in terms of racism and discrimination, but really, policing is a significant and crucial and life-threatening problem that we have to find ways to address. Now, we have known for a long time that there is institutional racism. It's not recognised significantly, as Jallow was saying, but we know that this is a problem. ENAR has been talking about this as a problem for many, many years. And I think with the pandemic, with COVID-19, it highlighted these problems that we have in health, but also in policing. And we've seen things like racial profiling being on the increase. Where we have data, UK, France, Belgium, we can see that the racial profiling, the searches, the stop and searches are disproportionately targeting racialized groups. In the UK, before the pandemic, we have seen 9 times, black people stopped and searched 9 times more than white. During the pandemic, this disproportional stop and search was rising. In France and in Belgium, there were more fines given to people living in poorer communities, and that often is racialized groups. So we're seeing that the pandemic essentially created the conditions for the police to enforce these powers that we've never seen in a generation before this, and it's been these powers have been enforced in a racially biased way. Now, we as ENAR, a European Network Against Racism, but a lot of other civil society organisations, even Amnesty International, are calling European police force and their actions as restrictive, coercive, discriminatory, disproportionate, and unlawful. And the police are abusing their powers. And as I said, it's a racial bias that we can see. This is across Europe. In the UK, there has been an acknowledgement that there's institutional racism in the police. Over 20 years ago, we had the Macpherson report, which clearly acknowledged that. Today in Belgium, where I'm based, the police union, the police are still not acknowledging the fact that there is institutional racism within the police force. This is why a colleague who should have been presenting today with us will find it difficult to present, because the institutions are not recognizing the fact that they are biased and this is problematic. Now, all of these kind of coercive, restrictive, disproportionate, discriminatory actions of the police is more than just racial profiling. It can lead to death. Now, we know that with George Floyd, we've seen Black Lives Matter across Europe, but this is a problem also in Europe. In Belgium, there was a death of a young man, 19 years old, who had North African heritage, who died because he was fleeing from the police. It's known within racialized communities that the police are not protecting us and are to be feared. So this is why he was running away from the police. So now that we are coming out of lockdown, we're coming out of confinement, the police are still criminalizing dissent. Protest is being criminalized. we still have a problem here with policing. And I think what makes all of this so disheartening and so troubling is that there is a lack of accountability, there is a lack of sanctions. So when there is something wrong with the system, we need to have some sort of justice. And at the current time, we are not having that. So ENAR as an organisation, we are discussing now, what do we do? We've been talking about institutional racism for many, many years as organisations. It's been recognised in some member states, but what is it that we can do now? And I think there are some short-term actions that member states and national governments and parliamentarians can call for right now. And that's around accountability, that's around sanctions, that's around looking at police techniques, that's around data collection. So we need to know the number of stops and searches and if it's disproportionate, and that information needs to be made public. In the medium term, what I would call for, what we are calling for as an organisation, is that there needs to be a longer term kind of review of policing and a radical rethink of what we think of policing and how it cares for our communities, all of our communities. And so this needs to happen in dialogue with different communities. This is just in terms of policing, and I'm going to wrap it up here. But I want to also talk about structural forms of racism. And as you mentioned, Petra, we do have this roadmap. And one of the things that we're calling for on this roadmap is understanding what structural racism is. We need to move away from thinking of just individual forms of racism, just thinking about the few bad apples in the police force, and we need to understand what institutional racism, systemic racism is. And we need to acknowledge this. And we need to think about the intersections of inequalities. We can have national action plans against racism. That's a clear and easy way for us to move forward on that. And we need to have more data collection, and we need to listen to the community and respond to what they are demanding. And I will end it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ojeaku. So many things I could react to, but thank you very much for pointing out the importance of looking at policing. In the Netherlands now we have a big scandal in the tax services where there was definitely a case of institutional racism against parents of bicultural background in childcare tax support. Thinking of what Rick said, using terminology, using language. Of course, we have to fight against something, but also to fight for something. And I think the public space should be safe for everybody. At night, during the day, whether you're a woman of color, whether you're a man of color, everybody should feel safe. And you know what I say when people who are white like me, who said, I've never been asked for my ID. I have never been stopped. I will quote from now on a fantastic quote by Caroline Criado Perez, who has written a book on the invisible women, who was also very good on intersectionality. She says, anecdotes are not the plural of data. And so I think this is a very good way to say we need data, because your anecdote doesn't prove anything about the pain and the experiences of groups of people who have been saying this for centuries. So that being said, I would like to move to the next part of our webinar. We have another 10-15 minutes, and I would very much like to give the floor to Momodou, because you're writing the report. I am curious to see how you can use what has been said, but I would also like you to reflect on the effects of COVID-19 on racialized communities. I read an article, and I sent it to Giorgio, who will share it in the chat, that also when you look at gender, we talk about women and girls, but we don't differentiate. And women and girls of color have been affected in a completely different way than women of my class with a nice apartment. I mean, it's a class issue, it's a race issue, it's an age issue. So how has COVID-19 affected people of African descent?
Thank you very much, and thank you, really, the previous speakers. very clearly indicated some of the problems that we've been talking about for a long time. This is nothing new. When it comes to the question of COVID-19 and how it has impacted or disproportionately impacted people of color, I think it's something that that we need to talk about more, and I'm glad that, Petra, you'll be writing on this. For people of color, it is important to notice that there has been historical and generational disinvestment when it comes to the socioeconomic and political investment that other groups or the majority population have had. The disinvestment have been affecting people of color for a long time. Now, what COVID has done, it has magnified and showed very clearly, made visible the impact that this disinvestment, generational and historical disinvestment, has, the effect it has on people of color. If you take a few examples, there has been lockdowns, and then, for example, in Sweden, we've not had lockdowns, but what we say is, those of you that can stay at home, you stay at home and work from home. But the problem is, most of the time, people of color do not have that privilege to stay at home. They're the ones that do the cleaning, they're the ones that drive the buses, they're the ones that are out, and the kind of work that they have, which is at the bottom most of the time of the hierarchy, these are jobs that they do not have the privilege to stay at home and do. So they have to go as frontliners in order for the economy to work, in order for the country to work. So doing that puts them in a position where they have higher risk of getting the COVID-19. Number two, if you choose to stay at home, most of people of color, their source of income is minimal. They earn the least in almost every EU country. The pay gap, there was just a report that we published in Sweden here about people of African descent in the labor market and the pay gap. It shows that the more educated you are as a person of African descent, the bigger the pay gap between you and the rest of the population. It just doesn't make sense, because we politicians would say you have to educate yourself in order to be able to have good pay and have a good life. But as a person of African descent, according to this report, the more educated you are, if you are a PhD holder, the pay gap is a lot bigger between you and the rest of the population than if you have a primary school or high school certificate. So people earn a lot less, and that means that if you don't go to work, if you follow the restrictions and you don't go to work, you have to choose between not being able to feed your children or to pay your bills and your rent, or to go to work and risk your health. So these are conditions that we need to talk about. But because we live in a bubble, most privileged people, they assume that their living conditions are the same as everybody else. So when we make these policies, when we make these rules and these lockdowns, we never take into consideration people who are underprivileged, people who are struggling every day, working class people, poor people. We never take them into consideration. And this is something that I think the impact has been out of the charts. And in the UK, you have examples of it. You have examples in all of the whole of EU, but because we do not collect disaggregated data on race, for example, in Sweden, it makes it extremely difficult to be able to identify the most vulnerable groups. So we need to collect this data. We need to make sure that this information will come out there and it would help us in our future policy making. Thank you.
Thank you, Momodou. And I will actually forward to Giorgio the title of a book which I haven't been able to read, but which I will be reading over summer. It's called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It was an eye-opener how through laws, people have been disenfranchised in buying property in the 50s, because at that time, Americans of African descent, Black people, were not allowed to own property. So white people would be able to build up capital, and the kids would inherit the capital, and all of a sudden the income discrepancy is enormous. So I'm very curious to find out whether we have these kind of colored of law problems in Europe as well, to be followed up. I saw Domenica raise her hand, so please take the floor, Domenica.
Well, thank you very much, Petra. I think it's a very good point you are making, because in the Netherlands, that has been a discussion going on. There's a professor at the Free University who's mentioned how she has done some quick research on how lawyers and judges, how they have this racialized idea of society and themselves. And she said we need to do research on it. So there have been some research on it, but we need really to follow up and write our own book, because sometimes the danger of these American books is that we focus too much on them and we forget about our own story. So that's very important. I would like to make a couple of points. Another point is policing. As ECRI, we have our General Policy Recommendation number 11, and in all our country reports, and we have the abridged version, I have shared it in the chat. What you see is that in all our policy, when we go to do country reports, these are our recommendations in which we ask member states on all the points you have made on how is the police acting and how you need first to have a suspicion, and what are the action you should take against racial profiling, and also about when there are complaints on police actions, you have to have an independent agency who is going to control. So this kind of points we have been raising for many years. So I think that is something I would like to share with you as well, because these are important things, and how we then can use each other's documents, because this is what we do in our country reports. And last but not least is on COVID-19. Momodou was saying, yesterday we had a webinar under the auspices of the Greek presidency, and also with ECRI together, and on inclusive education during COVID-19. So that was a huge problem. What you see is access, because you say home learning, when you have the intersectionality between race and social affluency or position, or when, as Momodou was saying, the parents cannot be present because they have to work and they cannot assist their children. So what we are having is that children can lag back because of the situation, and that the measures taken are not taking into consideration this situation. So this is only on education and also on information. There have been a lot of research on what is happening, and I'm very glad to hear that the Greek presidency wants to come up with an Athens declaration. And this is something we have been focusing. And this pandemic, I'm afraid, is not going to be, it's the first but not the last one. So we need to really prepare ourselves how, whatever happens, when these things are happening, that racism and discrimination is not directly or indirectly affecting, be it people of African descent or Roma and others, because that's what's happening at the moment.
Momodou, I saw your hand, but I will give you the last word because of the time. In the report I'm writing on gender equality and non-discrimination, we will take into account also how voices were represented in the first phases, because there is this picture of the Dutch social partners, they call them. It's the people who are representing the employers and everybody else, and it's a group of 12. I wouldn't say angry, but definitely white men. So not every voice is represented at that table. Of course, people can represent other people's voices even if they're not of that community. Let's be sure for that as well. There are people who are allies, but that's another discussion. Ojeaku, I will give you the floor for 1-2 minutes to make some concluding remarks. Domenica, I will give you also 30 seconds, and then Momodou will get 2-3 minutes. So we will run a little bit late for the people who are watching us on Facebook, but I would really like to conclude in like 10 minutes, if that's okay with the organization. If not, if not, then we will be closed off anyway. But Ojeaku, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to just say something just in line with what I was talking about before with regards to accountability and sanctions and policing. We had a discussion with some of our members yesterday. We're holding these like online discussions, and one of our members was saying to me, like justice, racial justice is not just about accountability and sanctions of the police force when they do something wrong. She was saying that justice also means change. I think that this is what we are in the kind of, this is our opportunity now. to not only just have justice for individual cases and maybe any cases in the future, but to provide racial justice through policy and legislation change. And this can happen. So I would just like to end on that point, that racial justice can mean change.
Thank you. Domenica, can I give you the floor for a few last comments, please?
But first of all, thank you very much. And I think it's very important that the existence of ENAR is very important, because we need institutional organization to do this work. And I think more collaboration should happen between us all, because we are doing the work, and how we can cross-refer of what we do, but work together. And as you said, it's not going to happen overnight. So we need to work when we talk about policing in all our countries. We will continue to do this. In all the things which are happening, we have always to check who we talk to, who is missing out, and how to include them, and representation, and also creating strong institutions of inclusion is very important. Because of this dismantlement, at least in the Netherlands, that's my experience, and I think of many European countries, as long as you don't have organizations who are the checks and balances, you don't know what's happening. For example, yesterday, one small example in the Netherlands, there were, on the 26th, a couple of days ago, there was a proposal by two parties that a hate crime based on discrimination should be in aggravated circumstances in the law. So that's something ECRI has been pushing on for many years. What you see is that the some organizations which are very well organized, the LGBTI organization, sees that moment to put forward what it means. But because people, Black people in the Netherlands are not organized on this level yet, they miss this really means for them, for their own position, to really follow up on these parliamentarians and keep the discussion going. So we need strong organizations who are really following up, because if there is no check and balances, people will sometimes forget to include you, not to say this is what institutional racism is all about.
Domenica, and well, Momodou, can I give you the floor? I will make a few words at the end, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Really appreciate the session. And let me just quickly say it is very important we have this conversation. And being a part of the Council of Europe, I just want to emphasize the importance of not only speaking about this, but also taking action. The European Parliament had a resolution where they acknowledged the existence of structural and institutional racism against people of African descent. The United Nations have a resolution passed where they do exactly the same. Now it is time for the Council of Europe to take a stand. We are the guardians of human rights and the rule of law, so we cannot be left behind. We need to act, and we need to go beyond words to action. The other thing I wanted to also mention is that whatever is done, as it is said, nothing about us without us. It's important that there is a regular consultation with civil society organizations, with Black-led organizations on every step of the way. It is important that decisions are not made over people's heads. As a person who has been active in civil society, I know that I've been visiting so many political institutions, speaking. ECRI is one of them. The Council of Europe and the committee that I'm sitting in of equality is another, where I speak about people of African descent and the pain that we go through and the realities and the institutional and structural racism. But I have not seen those steps that I expected to see. Now that I'm sitting there, now I'm part of ECRI, but I'm also part of the Council of Europe, the Equality Committee. I feel it is my role and in my mandate to raise these issues and go from words to action. It is very important that we bring in all the different parties in this. ECRI plays a very important role, as I mentioned. One thing that I think we need to also do is the Council of Europe and ECRI should give more visibility to racism against people of African descent. ECRI, you do the country visits. It is important that when we do the country visits, we make sure that we take into consideration Black-led organizations so we can speak to them and hear their points of view. I know ECRI have visited Sweden so many times, but I need to challenge ECRI to make sure that when they visit other countries, Sweden included, you take this into consideration. We cannot continue to pay a blind eye on a reality that affects over 15 million EU citizens. It is not okay. And lastly, but not least, I also would like to say, now we have a chance and we have a choice. So let us act quickly, firmly, and collectively, not to lose ground in the global movement in the fight against racism. We need to do that now. We have that chance and we have that choice. So let's make the right choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Momodou. I'm very, very honored to have been part of this conversation. One personal anecdote: I am an expert on the Middle East. I was an observer and almost a participant in the Middle East revolutions. As I said before, my daughter was born in Egypt. When I saw the people standing on the streets and squares in many, many of the cities and the streets in the Middle East, they were asking for dignity. They were asking for inclusion. They were asking for social justice. One thing that I've learned myself, what went wrong, is that many of the people in the streets and the squares then did not go back. No, they didn't. There was no space for them in the institutions. So the counter-revolution happened. So if I combine my own experience and what has been said today, institutional change, legal change, awareness change can only happen if we join forces, if we also give each other the platform and voice. We don't give voice, but we step aside so somebody else can sit at the table. This is something I'm telling myself all the time. We will make a summary of this amazing conversation. And yes, Domenica, I realize that when you are such an experienced person as you, that sometimes you're like, my goodness, is there a collective amnesia? I've been doing this for a very long time, but sometimes people of our generations have put the seeds and then they blossom, and then others can smell the flowers because they can finally breathe freely. And this is, I think, what we're working on all together. So Ojeaku, Domenico, Momodou, and also the team behind the scenes, Giorgio and the others of the Secretariat. Big applause and have a wonderful day. Thank you very much. And I will leave the call now, so you can leave as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.